All right, so have you heard about this case where a federal judge called a Trump administration action wholly lawless?
Yeah, I saw that.
It really caught my eye. I mean, that's strong language, you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You don't hear that kind of thing every day coming from a judge, right?
Right. And it got me thinking, what went on here, that a judge felt the need to use those kind of words. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, wholly lawless. That suggests the court saw this as a pretty serious breach, going beyond just a simple mistake or disagreement.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to get into today, this whole situation with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a man who was deported to El Salvador by the Trump administration. And this case has raised all sorts of legal and, frankly, ethical questions.
Right. It's a complicated story, but we've got some solid sources to help us break it down. We've got reports from Politico and Reuters that really lay out what happened in court and the judge's findings. And we've got some analysis from Glenn Kirshner, who, he's a former federal prosecutor. He really digs into the potential fallout within the Department of Justice.
Yeah. So our goal today is to figure out, okay, how did this deportation even happen in the first place? What was the legal logic behind the judge's really harsh ruling? And then what are the consequences? What happened within the DOJ after all this went down?
Right. Okay. So I think to understand all that, we have to start by looking at Mr. Garcia's situation before this deportation even happened.
Okay. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he was living in Maryland. And back in 2019, an immigration judge granted him something called withholding of removal.
Right. And that's a key point here.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like legal jargon, though.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean for someone like Mr. Garcia in practical terms?
So basically, withholding of removal is a type of protection you can get if you're facing a real threat of persecution in your home country.
Oh, I see.
And in Mr. Garcia's case, the immigration judge decided that, yeah, if he was sent back to El Salvador, he would likely face persecution. Right. Something that could seriously endanger his life or his freedom.
So because of that, the U.S. couldn't deport him, right?
Exactly. It would have been against the law.
Okay, so he's got this protection in place, and then fast forward 6 years to 2025, and this is where things get really strange, because despite that protection, ICE just deports him.
Right, and not only do they deport him, they send him back to the very country he was protected from, El Salvador, and they put him in this facility called the Terrorism Confinement Center, CCOT.
Wait a minute. So he had this legal protection specifically because he was at risk in El Salvador and they deported him anyway, and to a place designed for suspected terrorists. I mean, how does that even happen?
Right. It's just baffling, and it immediately raises all these red flags about due process. Was he given any notice? Was he given any chance to fight this deportation?
Sounds like he wasn't.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it. And that's a huge problem, legally speaking.
Right. So this whole situation ends up in front of a federal judge, Paula Sheenus, and she orders the Trump administration to bring Mr. Garcia back to the U.S. by a certain date. And this is where we get to that really interesting court hearing.
Yeah, this is where things get really wild.
Yeah.
So the government is represented by a DOJ lawyer, Mr. Ruvini, and what he says in court is just mind-blowing.
Yeah, I read that quote where he says, "We have nothing to say on the merits. We concede you should not have been removed to El Salvador." I mean, that's a pretty big admission for a government lawyer to make, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's basically saying we were wrong. We messed up.
Yeah.
There was no legal justification for this deportation.
Wow. So the judge starts asking some pretty basic questions. What was the basis for detaining Mr. Garcia? Why was he sent to CCOT specifically? And Mr. Ruvini's response is, "I don't know. That information has not been given to me. I don't know."
And that's just incredible. You've got the government's own lawyer in court saying he has no idea why they did what they did.
Yeah.
It suggests a serious lack of communication, or maybe even a complete absence of any valid reason for this deportation.
So the judge is obviously paying attention to all this. The reports talk about how she points out just how unusual it is for the government's lawyer to have no explanation whatsoever for their actions in a case like this.
And in the end, she issues a very straightforward ruling. She says the defendants, the Trump administration, they admitted they had no legal authority to arrest, detain, or deport Mr. Garcia.
She basically says they didn't even have the right to do what they did right.
Exactly. And she goes on to say that their arguments about jurisdiction were basically bogus.
So she's not buying any of it.
Not at all. And she makes it clear that to fix this, they need to bring Mr. Garcia back to the U.S. And her language is strong. She says equity and justice compels this order. It's like she's saying this is a blatant violation of his rights and the government needs to fix it immediately.
Wow, okay, so that's a pretty strong rebuke from the judge. But then things take another crazy turn, and this all happens outside the courtroom. This is the part where we see the fallout within the Department of Justice.
Right. So according to reports, Attorney General Pam Bondi goes on Fox News Sunday and says that Mr. Ravini, the DOJ lawyer, the one who made those admissions in court, well, he's been put on administrative leave.
And the reason she gives is that he failed to vigorously argue on behalf of your client. I mean, that's kind of weird considering his client, the government seems to have acted illegally in the first place.
Yeah, it's definitely raising some eyebrows. And it makes you wonder if this is creating a chilling effect. What happens if government lawyers are afraid to admit when mistakes have been made?
Right. I mean, could this lead to a system where defending the administration becomes more important than actually upholding the law?
That's the concern, right? And the Reuters report also mentions that Mr. Ravini's supervisor, August Fente, was also reportedly put on leave. So it's not just the lawyer who was in court, but also his boss.
So you've got the lawyers who were supposed to defend these actions that the judge called wholly lawless, and they're seemingly being punished for not putting up a stronger defense, even when they had no legal ground to stand on. It's a bit strange, right?
Yeah, it definitely seems backwards. And this is where that analysis from Glenn Kirshner's YouTube video comes in. He basically argues that Mr. Ravini wasn't actually failing in his duty by admitting the government was wrong. He was actually acting ethically by being honest with the court, even though it put his client in a bad light.
So he was basically upholding his oath as a lawyer to be truthful, even if it wasn't in his client's best interest.
Yeah, that's the core idea, right?
Yeah.
Lawyers have a responsibility to be candid with the court. They can't just lie or misrepresent the facts. And in this case, it sounds like Mr. Ravini was stuck in a really tough spot because the government's actions were just indefensible, legally speaking.
So he was basically damned if he did and damned if he didn't.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the fact that he might have faced consequences for actually doing the right thing, for being honest, raises serious questions about the priorities of the people running the DOJ at that time. What message are they sending to their own lawyers?
I mean, if you punish lawyers for telling the truth, what does that say about your commitment to actual justice, right? It creates this really messed up incentive structure where it's more important to be loyal to the administration than it is to be honest about what happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you connect that back to the judge's initial ruling, calling the deportation wholly lawless, it starts to paint a disturbing picture of how the Trump administration was operating. How much respect did they have for the law, for basic due process?
Oh, yeah, it doesn't look good. So let's recap what we've covered here. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was deported to El Salvador even though he had legal protection preventing that from happening. He was sent to a facility for suspected terrorists. The government's own lawyer admitted they had no legal basis for doing this. And then the lawyers involved were seemingly punished for not putting up a stronger defense when it seems like they had no defense to make.
It's a pretty wild story. And it really highlights the dangers of an administration that's willing to ignore the law and punish people for pointing that out.
So here's something to think about after we wrap up this deep dive. What happens to our justice system when government lawyers are afraid to acknowledge when the government has screwed up? What are the long-term consequences if we discourage truthfulness and honesty within the very institutions that are supposed to uphold the law? I mean, it's a scary thought, right? It makes you wonder what kind of leadership we want in these positions of power and how we can ensure that our justice system actually serves justice.
Yeah, that's the big question, and it's one we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.